Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about logical fallacies and how to recognize them. These are sneaky errors in reasoning that can make an argument seem convincing when it's actually flawed. So being able to recognize these fallacies will help you analyze arguments more effectively, whether you're reading an article, listening to a podcast, a debate, or even crafting your own writing. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so here we have our table of contents. These are the things that we're going to be going over. How to recognize fallacies, fallacies in logic, which include begging the question, hasty generalization, and more. Fallacies that affect character or ethos, which include ad hominem, guilt by association, and using authority instead of evidence. And lastly, emotional fallacies, bandwagon appeal, slippery slope, and creating false needs. And we'll end that with a nice wrap up. Okay, so what exactly is a fallacy? A fallacy is an error in reasoning. It may sound logical, but it doesn't actually prove anything. And these types of mistakes can happen when someone misuses evidence, makes unfair assumptions, or manipulates emotions to convince their audience. For example, have you ever heard anyone say, "My lucky socks helped me pass the test"? Well, that's a fallacy because there's no actual real connection between wearing socks and acing a test. So let's go ahead and check out some of the most common fallacies. Now, I'm not going to give you all of them because there's many, but I'm going to give you the most popular ones. Okay, so the first is fallacies in logic. Now, these type of logical fallacies often pretend to be solid proof, but when you take a closer look, they fall apart. These fallacies might ignore important facts, exaggerate claims, use reasoning that sounds smart but actually proves nothing. Now we'll go over some of the biggest offenders. Classic one that we're going to start with is begging the question. Okay, now begging the question happens when someone's argument assumes that the very thing trying to prove instead of giving evidence. So this is just using their assumptions about the thing that they're trying to prove instead of giving us some facts, data, some valid reasoning. An example would be paranormal activity is real because I have experienced what can only be described as paranormal activity. So you see the problem in that specific one. This argument kind of goes in a circle and it doesn't actually prove anything per se. So instead of providing real evidence, it just repeats the claim in different words. Now, let's clear up a common misconception. Begging the question versus circular reasoning, because this may kind of sound the same. Circular reasoning is another fallacy that people usually confuse with begging the question and vice versa. So begging the question happens when an argument assumes that the conclusion is true without providing real support. It hides the assumption rather than making it obvious. So an example would be, we should trust the news because journalists always report the truth. This argument assumes that journalists are truthful without necessarily proving it. Now, circular reasoning is a specific type of begging the question where the argument literally restates itself, but in different words. So the Bible is true because God wrote it, and we know God wrote it because the Bible says so. So this argument circles back to the same claim without offering new proof per se. Okay, now some of the key differences between those two are that begging the question hides the assumption within the premise, and circular reasoning more obviously restates the claim as proof. They're both faulty, but watch out when you're analyzing and trying to identify them in an article. Okay, next we have hasty generalization. So this specific fallacy happens when someone jumps to a conclusion too quickly based on limited or biased evidence. So an example would be, I met 2 rude tourists from France, and so all French people must be rude. That's a really big assumption based off a very small sample size. Just because two people fit this specific stereotype doesn't mean that everyone else does. And this specific fallacy leads to unfair judgments and inaccurate conclusions. And we have a little comic here with 2 little squirrels. One of them says, I have never seen food that is not circle-shaped. All food is therefore definitely circle-shaped. And he is basing his evidence on this little pine cone thing. And the other squirrel says, I have never seen food that does not have straight edges. So we see right here that each are basing their assumptions off a very small sample size. Next, we have post hoc or false cause. This fallacy assumes that just because one event happened right before the other, the first must have caused the second. So an example would be, ever since I started wearing this lucky bracelet, my team has won every game. In reality, correlation does not equal causation. The wins could be due to just more practice, skill, or even luck sometimes. But the bracelet probably has nothing to do with it at all. And here we have an example of a Coca-Cola ad. Here we see that they're claiming that if we use their product, then we will be happy, popular, excited, etc. This type of fallacy is very popular in advertisements and commercials. Okay, and we have a few more here. So there's, like I said, there's tons of fallacies out there. But here are some that you might run into. Now we have straw man, false dilemma, and appeal to ignorance. Now, straw man specifically will misrepresent an argument to make it easier to attack. False dilemma, which is right here, will present only two choices when more options exist. And we have some examples you guys can read through. Appeal to ignorance, which I don't have here, but appeal to ignorance is another fallacy that says that it's saying that something must be true because there's no evidence proving it otherwise. So the more fallacies that you run into and then you start to recognize, the better you'll be at spotting arguments that are fallacious. Next, we have fallacies that affect character or ethos. Now, some fallacies don't even try to argue the point logically. Instead, they attack the person making the argument. For example, we'll talk about it in the next slide, but ad hominem fallacy happens when someone attacks the speaker instead of the argument itself. An example would be, we shouldn't listen to her views on climate change. She failed science class in high school. So the speaker's science grade doesn't actually prove whether the argument is right or wrong. And this type of fallacy is often used to distract us from the real issue at hand. And let's take a closer look to ad hominem. So for this specific fallacy, instead of debating ideas, people use this fallacy to discredit the speaker with personal attacks. So again, another example would be, you can't trust what he says about taxes. He's a millionaire. Having money doesn't mean someone's opinion on taxes is automatically wrong. The focus should be on the argument itself and not the person making it. And we have an example right here. It says, you wouldn't understand since you have never had to struggle. Well, again, we don't know that that is not true, but it is a personal attack, right? It doesn't mean that he has not struggled. We don't know that. Or she doesn't know that. All right. Next, we have guilt by association. So this is another character-based fallacy, and this specific one happens when someone rejects an argument just because of who supports it. An example would be, you believe in renewable energy. That's what radical activists believe. Just because one group supports the idea doesn't mean the idea itself is bad. Ideas should be judged specifically on their own merits and not who believes them. We also have using authority instead of evidence. Now, this specific fallacy will argue that a claim must be true because an authority figure or expert said so. Think about those toothpaste commercials. Like 9 in 10 dentists recommend the brand of the toothpaste. Again, where we may think, oh, 9 dentists approve of this toothpaste, so it must be good. So this is using authority to validate a claim. Next, we have emotional fallacies. Now, not all fallacies rely on logic. Some play on our emotions, which is quite powerful. Emotional fallacies use fear, pity, outrage to manipulate their audience instead of using actual reasoning. So let's go ahead and check out the first one. So the bandwagon appeal fallacy argues that something must be right just because a lot of people believe in it. An example would be, everyone is buying this new diet supplement, so it must be the best one. Just because it's popular, it doesn't mean it's necessarily true or effective. So people used to believe the earth was flat. But again, popularity doesn't equal correctness. Next, we have a little meme right here. Everyone else is vaping, so maybe I should too. All right. Next, we have slippery slope and creating false needs. Now, slippery slope suggests that one small step will lead to extreme consequences without real valid proof. So an example would be, if we allow students to use calculators, next thing you know, they won't know how to do basic math at all. Now, this is specifically really funny because that's kind of what we used to hear, right, in school. The next one is creating false needs. Now, this convinces people that they need something unnecessary. So an example would be, you must buy this expensive face cream to be beautiful. Now, both of these fallacies push people toward extreme conclusions without providing real valid evidence. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. Fallacies are errors in reasoning that weaken arguments. So we want to make sure that we remember that. Some fallacies may pretend to be logical, but fail under closer inspection. So that's when we do our close reading. Others attack people instead of arguments, or use emotions to distract from the facts. Next time you hear an argument, whether it's on social media, the news, or a debate, ask yourself, is this argument based on solid reasoning? Is it using real evidence or just emotional appeals? Does it rely on personal attacks or assumptions? Recognizing these fallacies will help you think more critically, avoid weak arguments, and build stronger cases in your own writing, specifically an essay too. All right. Thanks so much for listening. I'll chat with you guys later. Bye.